by not including teachers front and center in that story.
Oi. Dear colleagues, please take a seat so that we can start. Thank you for coming to the Tertulia. Before I introduce the two speakers, I would like to introduce the concept of a Tertulia for those who are not familiar with it. So we invited, in this case, two experts on a chosen topic, which is this time racism and anti-racism in the history of education. They will both have 20 minutes to present their views on this topic. Then you are invited to respond to each other, and then you, the audience, is invited to ask questions and to engage in a conversation or a discussion as well. We don't have so much time, so we will have to see how much time will be left for questions and discussion. I will start with introducing Jarvis Givens. He is a professor of education in the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. An interdisciplinary scholar specialized in 19th and 20th century African American history, history of education, and theories of race and power in education. And today, special attention goes to his award-winning book on fugitive pedagogy, published by Harvard University Press in 2021. The second speaker is Surya Pombo, historian who obtained a master's degree and PhD in history and history of education at the University of Sao Paulo. She is currently adjunct professor at the Education Center of the Federal University of Paraíba, working in the areas of educational policy, history of education, and racial relations. Her areas of interest are history of the Black population's education, education in the 19th century, education after the abolition, which means here 1890 to 1930, and education and women in the 19th century. And today, offering a view on an overview actually on Black educational experiences in Brazil participants, she is offering or she will pay special attention to Black students, Black teachers, and Black intellectuals in Brazil. Okay, I will open the floor and would like to ask you, Jarvis, to come over.
Good evening, everyone. Just waiting for the slides to come up. And as they're pulling the slides up, I'll just say the comments that I'm going to share are thinking through some of the important concepts that came up in my book on the subversive history of Black teachers, in my book, Fugitive Pedagogy. But I'll also be talking a bit about my historical approach to uncovering the histories of Black teachers in the US and some methodological questions that I've been thinking through about the history of Black education. All right, so the slides are up. And the title of this talk, the comments that I want to share is Black Reconstructions, Archival Assembly, and the Submerged Histories of Liberatory Education. There's a peculiar silence in education research, and it has great implications for both theory and practice. The field of education has given little attention to the problem of the archive, or collections of physical sources systematically preserved and organized for studying the educational past. My sensitivity to silences in the historical record extend from my training in African American studies, an interdisciplinary field that seeks to describe dynamics of Black life and culture with more nuance, clarity, and beauty. Scholars of Black studies pursue more freedom and justice for all of humanity, especially those most vulnerable in our societies. Black studies and education studies are similar in that they are both problem-oriented interdisciplinary fields. However, while they both maintain a shared commitment to social transformation, Black studies begins from a place of recognizing racial domination as foundational to the social world and a force that must be accounted for in any pursuit of justice and collective flourishing. So, how might a Black studies orientation to the archive invite more expansive visions of Black educational history? And what implications might revisions to Black educational history have for the national and transnational stories of education? These are the questions that animate my research. My goal of producing more descriptive and illuminating narratives about Black social life, about Black school life, has required a methodological approach that accounts for silences in the archival record. And this awareness informs my reconstructions of the educational past and my interests in how that past relates to our present. Recognizing that there is much to be learned from material sources left behind by Black educators, students, and communities, I strive to imagine how the archive might be reconstituted to enable new ways of seeing and knowing. In my very first trip to conduct archival research about education presented an unexpected opportunity to reflect on these questions. In July of 2013, I encountered the autobiography of Sandy Rufus Youngblood, which you can kind of make out pictured here on the screen. It's a photo of Sandy Rufus Youngblood, and then this is the handwritten autobiographical sketch in the back of an old estate ledger. In this 15-page autobiographical sketch, Youngblood discussed his family's history of enslavement, his coming of age during Reconstruction, and ultimately, his becoming a lifelong educator, having taught in the state of South Carolina, Georgia, and Oklahoma as a public school teacher, then a principal, and ultimately as a college professor at a historically Black college. This intimate story of Black enslavement and educational striving was handwritten in the back of an old estate ledger, a clerical instrument developed to increase the efficiency of record keeping during the slave trade. Youngblood's parents and ancestors would have been taken into account as quantities in ledgers of the plantation and the slave ship. So on the screen here, you see part of the image to my left of Youngblood's handwritten autobiography in the back of a ledger, and to the right, if you could make out the text, you would see the names of, not the names, but actually information about enslaved people in the back of a ledger of a plantation, kind of a ledger for the estate of a plantation owner, right? So what I'm showing is how the history of the object of the ledger is actually something that's developed during the period of enslavement and expanded for the purposes of increasing accounting practices for the business of the slave trade. And it's important to note that after slavery was abolished, wealthy white landlords and shop owners continued to use the ledger as a tool of anti-Black domination. A record book for marking up debts owed by Black farmers and sharecroppers, many of whom were illiterate and unable to contest such economic exploitation. Sandy Youngblood's decision to write his life over the grid of the ledger challenged past and present Black subjection. His literacy, life, and self-narration all belonged to a heritage that critiqued the social order and the use of the ledger as anti-Black technology. So I want to share that I found this ledger by Sandy Rufus Youngblood in a box labeled oversized items in the Sandy Rufus Youngblood collection at Emory University. This small yet rare collection on Black pedagogy was, at the time that I found this, unprocessed in the library at Emory University. And this is a fact that reveals distinct challenges plaguing Black collections from the post-Civil War era. So this in the US is the era after slavery was emancipated. Because even when Black people produced an extensive written record, the history of racism within the universities, but also the experiences of economic insecurity and other forms of structural neglect led to the loss and inaccessibility of Black archives. Such dynamics in the archive exemplify what my colleague Sarah Lewis has come to call negative assembly. And with this term, she's referring to the excision and exclusion of details, ideas, and historical materials to block scrutiny or skepticism about the foundations of white racial supremacy and the racial order it secured. So thinking alongside Lewis, I assert that though African Americans in the period after slavery up and through the 20th century had more access to literacy, even though they had more access to opportunities to narrate themselves and to put it in written form, the loss and erasure of historical materials did not cease, because one cannot assume archival abundance in the afterlife of slavery. And in fact, it's historians of transatlantic slavery who have been critical to my thinking on this topic. These are scholars who are often forced to rely on records left by slave traders to produce new stories about the enslaved. But we know that Black people appear in these sources mainly as commodities. They appear as numbers, like they did in that ledger, as captive bodies, fungible beings denied individualities, right? Rarely will we find the names of these individual people. Sometimes we won't even find information about the gender distribution of the enslaved people in the hold of slave ships, right? But they're reduced to mere property and commodities to be traded. But there are scholars like Vincent Brown and Marisa Fuentes and Saidiya Hartman, and these are all historians of Black studies, and many others who have led the way in contemplating the challenges and the possibilities of reconstructing Black life worlds given such violent limitations that structure the archive that we have to rely on. And it's important to note here that slavery's archive is problematic not only because the identities of the captives were violently erased in the documents, but also because of the aggressive neglect of sources that privilege the perspectives and the interior lives of the persecuted, right? Because we know that there are sources that privilege and that documented the voices and the experiences of enslaved people themselves, but those were not valued as the things worth preserving, right? This has to do with the way in which power shapes the production of archives and the preservation of them. Having recognized these limitations, some scholars turned away from the archive towards theoretical and methodological questions about how to read what is not recorded in these materials. And then there are others who have worked and developed strategies for interpreting the archive more inventively, right? And more thinking about creative ways to read the archive, to try to extract information that's not explicitly there. For instance, the scholar Saidiya Hartman has explored what is possible through a full exploitation of the subjunctive, right? And scholars who study, language will understand the subjunctive as the what if, the could have, the what might have been. And then there are some who move beyond the archive completely, choosing to pursue more than material remnants of the past for historical reflection. Essentially what I'm saying, that because of these challenges in the archive, there are a number of people who have turned away from only relying on archives for the purposes of engaging with the histories of the Black past, right? About slavery, but about other things as well. But a key part of my historical method has been the work of what I've come to call archival assembly. And this has to do with the discovery, preservation, and at times rearrangement of historical collections to address erasure and archival silences. And so these three commitments that I just named around discovery, preservation, and rearranging archival collections to address gaps in the historical record will kind of be the pieces that I want to pull apart for the remaining time of my comments here. And I'm going to discuss this in relationship, like I said, to just a kind of a quick story from my first book, but also to talk about how that led to an archive that I've been building called the Black Teacher Archive. The first book is the image to the left. This is just an advertisement for the Black Teacher Archive, which is an online digital collection that I'll say more about. So I want to talk about this work of assembling what I call a fugitive archive on Black teaching in the US. So my desire for a new interpretation of Black educational history actually began with the textbook. I came across a passing reference to textbooks written by a scholar named Carter G. Woodson in the United States. On this image on the screen, if you were able to kind of make it out, you might be able to see some of the images, but these are images of Black students in New Orleans, Louisiana in the 1930s, and they're holding in their hands copies of these textbooks titled The Negro in Our History, written by Carter G. Woodson, first in 1922, and it would go through a series of new publications. But this struck me because while I knew Carter G. Woodson to be the famed historian and the child and student of formerly enslaved people, I should say Carter G. Woodson was the second Black person to receive a PhD in history from Harvard in 1912. You know, I was familiar with that part of his history. I was also familiar with his famous and iconic book entitled The Miseducation of the Negro, which I luckily found a copy in Portuguese at the bookstore here today as it was recently translated. I was excited to find this. But I was familiar with all these things about Woodson, but I was never familiar with the fact that he wrote school textbooks while working as a public school teacher and that they were widely disseminated among Black teachers. And essentially what I'm saying is that this posed a narrative problem for me because it went against so many of the narratives told and retold in the United States about the inequality and the lack and the deficiencies of Black education prior to 1954, when we have the landmark ruling that rules racially segregated schools to be unconstitutional, right? I'm not saying that the history of inequality in terms of the distribution of resources is not true. That is true, but it only captures part of the story, right? And these textbooks published by Carter G. Woodson represent an alternative tradition among Black teachers that is not captured in that story of separate and unequal. They failed to remember the art of Black teaching, which I wrote about in my first book. A legacy represented by those very textbooks published by Carter G. Woodson, but also reflected in the work of everyday Black teachers during the period of Jim Crow in the United States. And I want to share the story of a teacher that I opened, whose story I used to open this book, because it'll then expose what I'm talking about this subversive intellectual and political history of Black teachers. And her name was Tessie McGee. Tessie McGee read to her class in a steady, measured tone, quietly engaging in calculated acts of subversion. She was Black, 28 years old, and she taught history in 1933 at the only Black secondary school in Webster Parish, Louisiana. The all-white Department of Education and local school board gave clear instructions. Teachers were to keep the pre-approved outline openly displayed on their desks, which they were to follow closely to acquaint their students with the targeted learning objectives. Black educators and families in Webster Parish had little formal control over curriculum. Yet on many occasions, Ms. McGee made what she deemed to be necessary revisions to the mandatory curriculum. Based on her own judgment, and perhaps at the recommendation of fellow Black teachers, she often read passages from Carter G. Woodson's book on the Negro, which rested comfortably in her lap. She kept this textbook out of sight, understanding that if she were to be caught, she would be vulnerable to the disciplinary authorities during the racial segregated school system. But she was undeterred. And one of Miss McGee's students from that year recounted, quote, "She read to us from that book. When the principal would come in, she would simply lift her eyes to the outline that resided on the desk, and she began teaching us from the outline. When the principal disappeared, her eyes went back to the book in her lap," end quote. Tessie McGee's method of instruction constitutes a textbook example of what I came to call fugitive pedagogy. Fugitive pedagogy consists of African Americans' physical and intellectual acts that explicitly challenged anti-Blackness in the context of American schools. And these were actions that often took place in discreet or partially concealed fashion. And my use of this term fugitive, I want to say quickly, draws inspiration from a lot of important scholarship in Black studies. And it is especially referencing the historical archetype of the fugitive slave, who emerged as a kind of folk hero in the curricular imaginations of Black people. What do I mean by this? What I'm saying is that as early as the 1890s, we find Black school teachers writing textbooks. And in these books, we find that they're presenting heroic stories about enslaved Black people who ran away from plantations, those who led slave revolts. And they write extensively about maroon communities in the dismal swamps of Virginia, but also they write extensively about quilombos, for instance, in the context of Brazil. We see this extensively written about even in Carter G. Woodson's textbook. So it was also clarifying to learn that the very first Black authored textbooks were actually written by fugitive slaves, many of whom became teachers. For instance, on the far right is the image of a man named James W.C. Pennington, who was an escaped slave from the state of Florida, who learned to read and write while he was on the run, and eventually became a principal of the African Free School in Connecticut, where he wrote a school book on the history and origins of the colored people, which he published in 1840. And so what I'm saying here is that this narrative of fugitive pedagogy is one that connects the history of Black enslaved people defying laws that made it illegal to learn to read and write with the actions of teachers like Tessie McGee at a time when Black education was technically legal, but when Black people continued to experience violent white resistance to their educational pursuits. So for instance, between 1866 and 1876, more than 630 Black schools were burned down across the southern states. And so now I just want to say, just talk quickly about the archive that grew out of this work. So after learning that Tessie McGee was using this textbook in the rural part of the United States, I wondered about how she got access to this. And then I learned that the teacher at Tessie McGee's school, you can't make out the words here, but this is a document from the Louisiana Colored Teachers Association, which documents the important work taking place at the school that Tessie McGee taught at. And we learned that the principal of her school, who was a Black man named J.L. Jones, was on the leadership of this organization. And that this organization also explicitly disseminated information about Carter G. Woodson. So you might wonder, why would she switch the textbook when the principal came into the room? And this is important because Black teachers knew that white superintendents on any day of the week could enter their classrooms. So we see them walking a tightrope because if they were to fall or be caught, there was no safety net to catch them. Black teachers were routinely targeted and fired for challenging white authority. And this is a document where we see Carter G. Woodson's life membership in these national Black teacher organizations, and a newspaper clipping where we see him meeting with Black teachers at one of their state teacher organizations. This is a newspaper clipping where we see the story of Carter G. Woodson's textbooks being found in a high school in the 1920s in the state of Oklahoma. The principal was threatened with his life and forced to resign, and the textbooks were confiscated, and the teachers were also reprimanded. And there are lots of examples of teachers being fired. These are some images of some iconic Black teachers in the US who were fired between the 1890s and the 1930s for teaching against the grain and engaging in politics that were deemed unacceptable by local white school boards. And it's important to note that there were some teachers who lost more than their jobs. This is an image of teachers named Harry and Harriet Moore who were fired in the 1930s after they were organizing against working to equalize salaries between Black teachers and white teachers, and they were later killed when their home was bombed after they were organizing against the police killing of a young Black man who was being falsely accused for sexually assaulting a white woman in the state of Florida. And so Black teachers were aware of this. And so they concealed some of the work that they were doing. And so when I was writing this book, I wanted to kind of try and document this network between Black teachers and intellectual leaders like Carter G. Woodson. But what I found after traveling all over the country was that many of these documents were hard to find, and they were in unprocessed historical collections. You know, and if you can see the state of some of these materials on the screen, they were not always being well preserved or in good condition. Sometimes I was told that these materials didn't exist, only for them to later be discovered in an old plastic bin, rotting away in a closet. And so since 2018, I've been building what I've been calling the Black Teacher Archive to locate and catalog and digitize all of the records of these colored teacher associations so that they'll be preserved for future research, but also to make sure that they're accessible for scholars well beyond my research and well beyond my time as well, right? So this has become an extension of this work that I've been doing on fugitive pedagogy, trying to preserve the record that exists of the important work that Black teachers did. And so at this point, I'm going to close my comments, but I just want to show a very brief video that tells you a little bit about the Black Teacher Archive, and it'll allow you to see some of the visuals that are included in this collection for you to get a sense of what it entails. And so as they're pulling this up and they'll show the video, and then I'll take my seat, I just want to say that these materials are open access. You don't need university credentials to get access to them. And they are on an online portal that allows for in-text searching. So you can search the names of teachers, information about particular schools, and as they pull up the video, I'm going to take my seat. Just wanted to share that information, that it doesn't require having university access in order to get access to this information, which I think is important around democratizing this information for people outside of the academy to also be able to get access to it. Thanks.
We've been missing a very, very important part of the Black freedom struggle by not including teachers front and center in that story and elevating the work of educators when it comes to Black collective struggle. The Black Teacher Archive is this digital portal that houses the records of colored teacher associations, particularly their journals. These are digital representations of these physical materials that exist all over the country.
We're trying to provide a different form of access and also honor the care that has already been provided to the material.
Mm-hmm.
We're taking advantage of what it means to live in the digital age, and with the hopes of kind of revitalizing some aspects of tradition, but also to say, there are things that we can do now that couldn't be done 20 or 30 years ago in terms of digitizing.
One of the most important things that can happen is that allows us to tell much more robust stories about the role that teachers played in all aspects of Black life.
When people think about the civil rights movement, teachers are not necessarily the people that come to mind. There are all these individual figures, but then when you sit back and wonder, well, where did all of these great and important leaders come from? When we think about their oratorical skills, right? When we think about their ability to imagine a world outside of the confines of Jim Crow, where did they learn that?
Despite the extraordinary blooming that has happened in African American studies, we are still mining for the stuff of the tradition that we need to do to fashion, shape the the field, to tell the story. I do think that this project is yielding a lot of gold.
We will immediately go to our second presentation, Surya Pombo offering us a Brazilian perspective on the topic. Please, the floor is yours.
Boa tarde. Eu quero começar agradecendo o convite, né, da organização do evento. Quero agradecer à professora Inês e à professora Olivia, em nome de toda a ISCHE, por me convidar para estar aqui hoje. É uma honra e uma alegria muito grande estar aqui falando do meu trabalho e discutindo, né, conversando com o professor Givens. Como já foi apresentada brevemente, eu sou professora da Universidade Federal da Paraíba e venho estudando sobre educação e população negra em uma perspectiva histórica desde os meus primeiros trabalhos. Hoje, a convite da organização do evento, eu vim aqui discutir sobre a importância da história da educação brasileira para a educação atual, para uma educação antirracista. Por isso, eu organizei minha apresentação em 3 partes, em 3 momentos diferentes. Está bem ruim, né? Não, achei que fosse ficar melhor esse slide, mas é só para ajudar aqui a acompanhar. Em primeiro lugar, eu quero fazer uma breve apresentação de como a história da educação se desenvolveu no Brasil e como a população negra foi incorporada nas pesquisas. No segundo tópico, eu tratarei das pesquisas atuais, apresentando alguns aspectos, alguns temas, algumas questões que têm sido desenvolvidas por pesquisadores e pesquisadoras sobre o assunto. E na última parte, como já anunciei, pretendo destacar a importância dessas pesquisas, a importância da história da educação para pensar e atuar na educação escolar nos dias de hoje. Então, a história da educação brasileira se desenvolveu desde o século XIX, se consolidando na segunda metade do século XX. Isso pode ser visto em diferentes aspectos, como a expansão da pesquisa em acervos documentais, o aprofundamento teórico, a autonomia em relação à filosofia da educação, o fortalecimento da pós-graduação, a organização de grupos de pesquisa, e também na ampliação de temas, objetos, filiações teóricas e metodológicas dos estudos realizados, como diversos autores e autoras brasileiros, que inclusive estão aqui nesse evento, já discutiram e vêm discutindo. Porém, mesmo nesse processo de ampliação dos interesses e no fortalecimento da história da educação na segunda parte do século XX, e o surgimento ou o fortalecimento dos sujeitos nas pesquisas realizadas, apesar de tudo isso, havia um silêncio sobre a população negra. Ou, como Marcos Vinícius da Fonseca, um importantíssimo autor da temática, denunciou várias vezes, uma invisibilidade em relação ao negro nas pesquisas em história da educação. Esse silêncio pode ser explicado por diversas razões, que são internas e também externas ao campo. Eu vou mencionar algumas delas, algumas dessas razões. A proibição jurídica de escravizados nas leis educacionais do século XIX, a associação imediata entre negros, africanos e escravizados, que durante muito tempo foi feita no Brasil, uma pretensa ausência de fontes que permitissem estudar pessoas negras e educação no passado. Além disso, questões que não são internas ao campo, mas que muito nos influenciaram, a ideia de que a escola pública era elitista, antes do período de democratização ou massificação do ensino, a depender de quem fala. Portanto, essa escola teria interditado a presença negra após a abolição, e o mito da democracia racial, que impedia que pesquisadores reconhecessem que raça é tão importante quanto classe social nas explicações sobre a realidade brasileira. Durante a década de 1980, houve uma inflexão nos debates sobre relações raciais no Brasil. O fim da ditadura militar, a reorganização de diversos setores da sociedade brasileira exigindo mudanças, como, por exemplo, o movimento negro, a Constituição Federal de 1988, os debates gerados desde o início dos anos 80 sobre o centenário da abolição da escravidão, impulsionaram a discussão sobre o impacto que a escravidão e como foi o período do pós-abolição tiveram na estruturação da nossa sociedade. As pesquisas acadêmicas influenciaram e foram influenciadas por tais processos, e também a história da educação brasileira. A história da educação brasileira também foi impactada pelas mudanças em relação a esses temas. A partir daí, com muita força, a população negra emergiu como sujeito crucial para o entendimento da educação em perspectiva histórica. Aquelas questões que tinham naturalizado a ausência negra dos estudos passaram a ser revistas. A ampliação no entendimento sobre fontes históricas, a mudança na compreensão sobre legislação. Ou seja, um exemplo, escravizados, de fato, foram proibidos em todas as leis imperiais, de todas as províncias, de se matricular e frequentar a escola. Porém, as leis podiam ser burladas e as leis eram modificadas ao longo do século XIX, dependendo do contexto de cada região, de cada momento, chegando, inclusive, a permitir a presença de pessoas escravizadas em certos momentos. Por exemplo, isso muda a percepção da lei, de como a gente vê a legislação. Além disso, a compreensão de que escravizado, negro e africano eram categorias diferentes, que poderiam, em alguns momentos, a mesma pessoa estar nas três, ou podia estar em duas delas, mas não necessariamente eram sinônimos, ajudaram também a modificar essa forma de perceber a população negra em relação à educação no passado. Além disso, trabalhos começaram a mostrar que era possível encontrar pessoas pobres em escolas, mesmo antes dos anos 1950, 60. E o mito da democracia racial começou a ser revisto. Ou seja, nós começamos a discutir que a inexistência da segregação jurídica, como aconteceu, por exemplo, nos Estados Unidos, como a gente acabou de ver na fala do professor Givens, e a ausência de escolas específicas para negros aqui no Brasil, essa inexistência de leis raciais a partir da abolição, depois da abolição, ajudou a construir a ideia do Brasil como um paraíso da harmonia racial, quando se tratava no período pós-1888. Ou seja, se a ideia que se tinha até mais ou menos esse período dos anos 1980 era que não era possível pensar em educação de população negra no período de vigência da escravidão, porque a escola era interditada na legislação, as mesmas pessoas acreditavam que no pós-abolição não haveria diferença oficial entre brancos e negros, porque de fato não houve, na legislação não houve diferença oficial. Portanto, não seria necessário problematizar ou parar para pensar no assunto. As mudanças ocorridas a partir dos anos 80, que eu acabei de mencionar, representam um marco em relação a isso. No fim do século passado, início dos anos 2000, o que podemos ver nas pesquisas são novas perspectivas em toda a história da educação. E na que a gente está tratando hoje aqui, trabalhos como, por exemplo, acho que o slide está um pouquinho adiantado, mas tudo bem. Trabalhos como o de Adriana Paulo da Silva e Marcos Vinícius da Silva começavam a mostrar que era possível e urgente incluir a população negra nas explicações sobre a educação brasileira. A partir daí, houve uma grande renovação no nosso campo, e eu entro no segundo momento da minha apresentação. a ampliação desses debates, que eu já mencionei, sobre relações raciais, a pressão do movimento negro, as ações afirmativas, a partir de 2002, que trouxeram, né, que trazem para a universidade estudantes negros, pobres e periféricos para o ambiente universitário, e com esses novos sujeitos nesse espaço que até então era muito difícil de ser acessado por eles, eles trazem novos interesses de pesquisa. E, finalmente, leis educacionais reconhecendo que a escola brasileira é um espaço de reprodução e também de produção do racismo, fizeram com que a gente tivesse mudanças. A Lei 10.639, de 2003, que obriga a inserir história e cultura africana e afro-brasileira nos currículos oficiais da educação básica, e que também vai afetar depois a educação superior, é um marco nessa discussão. Eu voltarei a tratar dela na última parte da fala. Ou seja, a consolidação das pesquisas sobre populações negras no Brasil, que a gente vê com muita força a partir dos anos 2000, pode ser vista na variedade de períodos históricos estudados, do período colonial ao século XXI, de regiões analisadas. Todas as províncias e estados praticamente foram pesquisados, estão sendo pesquisados, na diversidade de temas, articulando a presença ou mesmo denunciando a ausência negra, instituições, gênero, profissão docente, geração. Então, nós temos estudos sobre escolas específicas para meninos negros, para meninas, para adulto, para criança, pesquisa sobre professor, professora, ou seja, várias temáticas caras à história da educação são articuladas com a questão da população negra. Atualmente, né, nos dias de hoje, além desses temas já consagrados e que continuam sendo estudados, eu quero destacar algumas novidades ou temas que estão muito fortes nos dias de hoje. Primeiro, a ideia de populações negras no plural, reconhecendo as diversidades nas experiências negras, a forte presença de estudos sobre intelectuais negros e mulheres negras intelectuais, a docência de homens e mulheres, além do interesse em histórias comparadas e transnacionais, inserindo as experiências negras no contexto da diáspora africana, comparando populações negras brasileiras com de outros países das Américas. Botei alguns livros que eu estou sugerindo como possibilidade para quem tiver interesse em conhecer melhor esses trabalhos. Algumas fotografias exemplificam essa diversidade, né, essa diversidade de experiências, como a desses intelectuais, desses homens negros intelectuais no século XIX, que foram escritores, advogados, escreveram na imprensa, foram professores, em diferentes regiões do país, no Rio de Janeiro, no Maranhão, na Bahia, na Paraíba, né, estado de onde eu venho, foram políticos, representaram muitas vezes a província na Assembleia Geral, no Rio de Janeiro, na corte. A gente tem também pesquisas mostrando as mulheres negras, professoras, escritoras, jornalistas, já no século XIX. Na primeira parte do século XX, podemos encontrar docentes e discentes em escolas públicas, como esses do estado do Rio de Janeiro, assim como mulheres negras intelectuais, políticas, professoras, jornalistas. Também temos pesquisas sobre instituições promovidas por pessoas negras no século XX, como o Teatro Experimental do Negro, a Imprensa Negra e a Frente Negra Brasileira, por exemplo. Ou seja, existe uma diversidade de experiências e essa diversidade de experiências tem sido pesquisada pela história da educação brasileira nas últimas décadas. E, finalmente, para entrar na terceira parte, né, da minha apresentação, após esse breve apanhado sobre a história da educação brasileira, brevíssimo, dado o tempo, eu quero chegar aos dias atuais, né, e ao tema da tertúlia, ao tema do convite: racismo e antirracismo e história da educação. Apesar de todas as experiências exibidas, a escola brasileira é desigual quando se comparam resultados e experiências de pessoas brancas e pessoas negras. O reconhecimento disso gerou mudanças na legislação nas 2 últimas décadas. Como anunciei, a Lei 10.639 é um marco disso, e outras normas, outros regulamentos, outras diretrizes, outras leis vêm sendo realizadas no sentido de modificar essa escola. Debates sobre currículo, formação docente, materiais didáticos são alvo de pesquisa e realizações com o intuito de mudar, de modificar essa escola. E a história da educação brasileira pode e deve ajudar nessa produção de uma escola antirracista, que é o nosso objetivo. Questões como legislação, cotidiano escolar, relação professor-aluno, linguagens escolares presentes na escola. Entender esses temas pode ajudar a explicar o que alimenta esse padrão de desigualdade no acesso e principalmente na permanência e a qualidade dessa permanência na educação formal ao longo desses 2 séculos de histórias, quando se trata de alunos, alunas, professores e professoras negras. Essa é uma tarefa que nós, historiadores e historiadoras da educação, estamos tentando realizar. Portanto, quando a história da educação brasileira considera a agência negra e reconhece as possibilidades de aproximação entre pessoas negras e o universo letrado, ela pode ajudar a modificar o entendimento sobre a escola e sobre a visão que se tem sobre pessoas negras. Quando as pesquisas mostram a existência de pessoas escravizadas e livres, que sabiam ler e escrever, que iam à escola, que publicavam livros, que escreviam na imprensa, mesmo durante o período em que vigorava a escravidão, essas pesquisas ajudam a modificar a maneira como pensamos sobre essas pessoas escravizadas e sobre as pessoas negras, mostrando a relação entre esse grupo da população, ou esses grupos, no plural, e o pensar, o estudar, o ler, o escrever, e isso pode mudar a escola, hoje. Quando as pesquisas mostram a existência de intelectuais negros e negras, estudantes e docentes negros e negras, na primeira metade do século XX, convivendo com o forte racismo que não era nem mesmo assumido devido ao mito da democracia racial, a história da educação ajuda a mostrar a resistência negra e, portanto, pode modificar a nossa escola atual. Quando a história da educação se dedica a mostrar as exclusões, as dificuldades impostas a pessoas negras, o racismo que permeava as relações durante o processo de desenvolvimento da escola brasileira no século XIX e XX, e ao mesmo tempo mostra pessoas negras em espaços como academias, faculdades, escolas secundárias, quando mostra estudantes anônimos em escolas primárias, isso nos mostra diferentes possibilidades para estudantes negros e negras que estão na escola hoje, e vão se olhar de forma diferente, podem se olhar de forma diferente. Isso ajuda a modificar a escola atual. Portanto, desnaturalizar a educação, desnaturalizar a escola e desnaturalizar esse universo letrado são possibilidades que a história da educação pode contribuir para desnaturalizar as relações raciais na sociedade brasileira e, a partir disso, ajudar na construção de uma escola antirracista. Muito obrigada.
Well, thank you very much to both of you for these great presentations. I think, I don't know if Olivia is there, but I think we have to start closing. Unfortunately, there won't be time for questions, but it would be great to continue talking. We are going to the Ramp Museum in case you are coming. It would be great, and I hope we will continue. I just want to make a few notes. I don't know if Angelo, do you want to make other ones? But of both presentations, and what we wanted to do with the Tertulia was also to put this issue on the agenda and also to try to think about it transnationally and try to think about it in different contexts and how it has been played and the challenges we face today. I was thinking, well, this history is quite transnational. Slavery is transnational. It's a byproduct of a strong current of movement, of forced movement, of capitalism, of oppression that we need to put also in the history of education, but also the history of diaspora and the history of knowledge practices. I was thinking how the concept of race traveled and what it produced, and how also anti-racism travels and what it produces today. I'm thinking now of the repercussions of Black Lives Matter and of many other movements in which we are hearing its resonances in many other places. But sometimes, for example, the movement here in Brazil to aquilombar a universidade is not necessarily this idea of, well, thinking about the pedagogy of quilombos, of places of freed slaves, in terms of what they bring to the university, in terms of other knowledge practices. I think they should also travel and be known and be discussed elsewhere. I was thinking of what also Jarvis mentioned, the question of archive and the demand to produce archives. I think this is also part of what we need to do, and it has been done in several countries for different issues. I'm looking at Maria del Mar and also the archive of Republican teachers in Spain, and things that we need to actively produce in terms of stories, histories that are lost sometimes in the archives that, as he said, unprocessed or sometimes neglected, aggressively neglected or sometimes passively neglected, and how to understand how archives construct visibilities and invisibilities. No? And I think this is also something that, at least for me, stays from this panel. I don't know if Angelo you don't want to say anything else. I'm really sorry to be cutting the Tertulia short. We usually give only 1 hour to the Tertulia. Maybe this is something we should rethink for next time, at least give it 1 hour and a half, so we have time for discussion. But at least I think we get a glimpse of very interesting research that is being done in different countries, and also of very important problems that I think we need to address as a community. Thank you very much. Well, have a good evening. I hope you will join us at the Ramp Museum. There are buses already, so if you want to go outside after you leave your stuff. And we want to thank very much Jarvis, Surya, and all the team that's been supporting the translators. I hope it worked well. And see you tomorrow at 9 here.
Vamos ver se a gente cai na dependência do outro. E chegar lá e pode parar. É bom isso, porque se tiver espaço no ônibus, a gente já sobe logo. Mas se não tiver, não temos como receber. E dá mais Uber. Não, não. Assim, é por uma questão de justiça. Podemos, Tainá tá lá na frente.
aqui o ônibus que saindo aqui. Eu vou falar para ele que a gente pode ter